Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar recording around nutrition for Leaving Cert PE with myself, John Murphy, and Dr. Catherine Norton from the University of Limerick. We've loads of stuff we're going to touch on today, particularly around where to get evidence-based information, how to do dietary analysis, looking at the main contributors to diet and nutrition, particularly energy intake, protein, carbohydrate and fluid. And I'm delighted to say there are also a few pictures of cake dotted in throughout. Catherine, you're very welcome.
Hello everybody, my name is Catherine Norton. I'm delighted to be here speaking to you about the topic of PEAI exercise nutrition for the nutrition curriculum in the Leaving Cert PE. I'm an associate professor in sport and exercise nutrition at the University of Limerick and hope you find the content here helpful. We're all teachers, so I decided I'd put in some learning outcomes for you. These are not just the learning outcomes for you for today, but also the same learning outcomes that I would be hopeful that your students would get for the same content. So the concepts that we're going to be looking at are nutrition assessment and dietary assessment, and PEAI exercise dietary recommendations for both macronutrients. We're going to focus specifically on carbohydrates and proteins, and also for fluids. And then a part that I feel is often overlooked when it comes to dietetics or to nutrition is the translation of theory to practice. So how do you take the scientific information and ensure that athletes or supports staff and personnel can take this complex information and translate it into usable, practical information. So I'm hopeful that by the end of this, you'll have all of the knowledge and the skills that you need to enable your students to design a bespoke athlete nutrition plan to optimally support selected physical activity, whether it's for endurance or for strength or for a team sport, focusing specifically on energy, macronutrients and fluids. The what part is probably the area that you're most interested in getting information in. What kind of nutrients do athletes consume? The part that I think is often overlooked and the part that makes it more interesting for students and for athletes, something that they can grab onto and understand why they need to do certain things. So while the what is the main focus of the presentation today, we'll also look at why they are important and how do you translate this information from science to practice. Oftentimes I'm asked what is performance nutrition, and one of the easiest ways to try and explain it is in the context of a hierarchy. There's no point or no benefit whatsoever in launching in with high-tech, high-science sports and performance nutrition with ergogenics or specific strategies to fuel recovery or to fuel a specific physiological adaptation that you're trying to achieve in the absence of general healthy eating. So the very foundational aspects of performance nutrition are general healthy eating guidelines. Now most teachers, all teachers, will be very familiar with the food pyramid, and I'll touch on this very, very briefly, but I'm almost going to assume that there's an assumed knowledge here that you and your students will be well up to speed on nutrition for health, nutrition for growth and for development, and we're going to overlay that today with how do you advance that from nutrition for health to nutrition to train and nutrition to compete. From an athlete perspective, and students might readily identify with this as well, it's a case of trying to ensure that there's an awareness of this hierarchy that I mentioned already, but a progression from nutrition for health to nutrition to training to nutrition for performance. And an easy analogy that people can identify with is this whole concept of nutrition for performance being a cake. And if we start at the cake with the sprinkles and the icing and the whole lot on it, this is the icing on the cake and the sprinkles on the icing on the cake. And unfortunately for practitioners, this is probably where most athletes are interested. They want to know, tell me about creatine, tell me about supplements, what do high performance athletes do? But very few people, unless you're 5 years of age, eat sprinkles without all the other parts. So just going straight in with those high performance, the small additions that will give you competitive benefit is really of no benefit unless the predecessors are well established and in place. So working back from the sprinkles, we're looking at the icing, and the icing is really the focus for today. And these are specific strategies to fuel performance and to fuel and to recover after performance around a specific training stimulus. So we're going to look at what kind of training is done and how nutrition can either amplify or dampen down the physiological adaptations that arise from any specific training intervention that we're putting into place. And then the very foundation of that, as I've mentioned already, is the cake, the sponge, the healthy eating guidelines. I'm assuming that this is knowledge that people already have, but we're progressing from the cake, focusing on the icing, and the sprinkles are for another day. So that's what we're going to focus on today, nutrition strategies for training. I'm quite a visual learner, and when I try and remember all of the things that are in place from a nutrition perspective, and even when I'm teaching it to students in higher education and third level institutions, there are so many acronyms and abbreviations when it comes to performance nutrition. I suppose it's the same for many disciplines that can almost become a bit of an alphabetic spaghetti. There are lots of different things that you need to try and remember. But I've tried to condense it down for my own students in third level to a couple of acronyms that I feel are easy to remember. So by the end of this presentation, although it all looks like double Dutch at this stage, things like this ABCDEI of nutritional assessment, the FFR for food, fluids and activity records, the frequency, intensity, timing and type, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But we're going to progress all of these so that, in a nutshell, if students had just this, or if you had just this as a cheat sheet, it should give you a prompt as to what are you trying to find out, what do you need to know about athletes, where do you find the standards and recommendations with which you're going to compare a nutritional assessment, and how then do you plan and prescribe personalised, periodised approaches to macronutrient and fluids in order to optimise nutrition to support training. So bear with me. By the end of this, hopefully you'll know exactly what all of this is. What I'm hoping at the very end you'll have more confidence in, and the skills and competencies to develop, is a bespoke athlete nutrition plan to optimally support selected physical activities. And if we break that down a little bit further, bespoke means that there's a needs-based assessment to it, that it's specific to an athlete, that it's sports focused, that we're layering again from the cake, we're going on to the icing and looking at a specific sports focus in this. And from a nutrition perspective, we're going to focus on energy and macronutrients, more so protein and carbohydrates than fats, and a fluid plan, and that this will be evidence-based and research informed. So a bespoke athlete nutrition plan to support selected physical activity using a needs-based assessment and evidence-based practice. So if we jump straight in then to, in order to do this, what do we need to know? This is another one of my acronyms. What we need to know is everything that the athlete does pertaining to food and physical activity. So the who, what, when, where, why and how of how they train and what they eat. So you can see on the slide deck here that it's what they eat, when they eat, how much of it they eat. But you need to move beyond that to, in tandem and in parallel, what kind of training do they do? What stage of the season is it? What's their current body mass or composition? What age are they? Do they have any underlying conditions that we need to be aware of? And it can be quite challenging to do all of this in a processed, methodical manner. But there's quite a few research papers that have looked at how do you have a process to this? How do you systematize it so that for handovers from one practitioner to another that there's continuity in terms of the assessments that are done? So the mnemonic of ABCDEI has been around for a while. The E and I part are parts that researchers at the University of Limerick included into it. But this ABCDEI of nutritional assessment describes this needs-based assessment, or the gap analysis that practitioners or students should be able to identify is necessary to develop a bespoke, periodised, personalised approach to nutrition. And we're really only going to focus on the part that I have an arrow on today, the dietary habits and the dietary assessment. But very briefly, all of the other elements. Anthropometry speaks to body composition and body mass. So what does your athlete weigh? Of the weight that they carry, how much of that is functioning mass, lean mass, where they can generate power or generate strength? How much of that is non-functioning mass, fat mass? How much of it is bone mass, and how well are we protecting them for later life? That could be a whole other session. So if your students were able to give a nod to body mass needs to progress to body composition and lean mass and fat mass and bone tissue, that would be acceptable at this level. The B and C elements for biochemistry and clinical status are probably a little bit advanced for LCPE or even for entry-level practitioners in sports science. if students could give a nod to, I would ask if they had type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes or an underlying clinical condition or a pre-existing diagnosis of a deficiency in minerals or vitamins, that's sufficient there. So biochemistry and clinical status tie into that, but they're really kind of higher order things. We're going to look in more detail at the dietary habits, so I'll skip that for now. But the E refers to exercise. And when it comes to exercise, the athletic training is outlined there. The frequency, the intensity, the timing, the type of physical activity, because as we progress through the slide deck, you'll see that there are differences in the prescriptive information for macronutrients dependent on whether athletes are endurance, power and speed, strength, or anything along that continuum. And then this last part, which is often overlooked, the intent or the context. It's becoming a lot more spoken about in not just research, but also in practice-led publications. What is the athlete intending? What are they trying to achieve? What are their stated aims and objectives? Now, if you ask any of your second level students what they're trying to achieve from a nutrition perspective, the answers are generally, I'll get ripped and I'll get fast, or I need to get strong and I need to get lean. They're very generic types of aims and intents and contexts. But what we would like your students to be able to consider is, similarly to what I had on the previous slide, what stage of the season are we at? Is it a macro cycle that we've got 4 years to prepare for the next Olympics? Is it a meso cycle that they're in the Harty Cup? Is it a micro cycle that they've got an event at the very weekend? Are their intents and aims aligned with that of a coach or of a parent? Are they aligned with best practice guidelines? So we'll move on from this bit now because I could get sidetracked, but in a nutshell, this nutritional assessment, the ABCDEI, should allow your students to carry out an assessment, a needs-based assessment of what athletes need. Looking at all of those different parameters, they'd be able to determine what they currently eat, how they currently eat, what physical activity they're engaged with, and to build prescriptive, bespoke, periodised plans from there. So to focus for a moment on the dietary assessment, the D of the ABCDEI that we had on the previous slide, there are so many different methods and means to assess dietary intakes. Broadly speaking, these dietary assessment methods are split into household and individual, and prospective and retrospective. And really this just describes, are we looking at your whole house and your grocery shopping list and how it's done on a weekly basis? Or are we asking somebody to record everything that they eat and drink as they eat and drink it over the course of a day? There's lots of research and lots of systematic literature reviews on what type of dietary assessment are best fit for purpose. But for leaving certificate students, the gold standard in this context would be a prospective food, fluid and activity food intake record. So I have an arrow beside it here where we've got food records that can be either weighed or estimated. Really the burden for participants is so great, and for researchers when it comes to data entry for weighed food records. We focus on estimated food intake records. And the easiest example I can give you here would be using apps such as MyFitnessPal or other smartphone or smart technology devices, whereby an athlete would be asked to record in real time, I'm having my breakfast, I'll enter what I had. And household measures such as a medium bowl, an average glass, a spoon of honey on my Weetabix, whatever it is, those estimated food records are preferable and recommended for athletes for a period of between 3 to 7 days. So generally in practice we would say you need 4 days, you need a training day, a rest day, a competition day and a weekend day. And that should give you lots of information you need on, do athletes self-select to eat differently when they train to when they rest? Can they differentiate? Do they have enough knowledge to differentiate how they might eat differently on an endurance training day versus a strength or a skill acquisition training day? So these prospective food records, such as the apps like MyFitnessPal, there are actually many of them available, are the go-to really for whether it's in applied practice from sport and exercise nutrition perspective, but most especially for students and how they might go about asking athletes as part of their projects to record food intake in order for them to be able to assess it. So at this stage now we have a nutritional assessment and we have a dietary assessment, and we've also got a record of frequency, intensity, timing and type of exercise that's done in parallel with the food intake record that we've completed. So this is our needs-based assessment complete. It's almost like this gap analysis I mentioned of moving from a generic one-size-fits-all off-the-shelf, I'm a marathon runner, to we've done an analysis, we've done an assessment, we can now make this bespoke to this individual's requirements, dependent on their anthropometry, their clinical status, their dietary records, their exercise, and their aims and intents. And now we've got to decide, what do we compare this to? So we know what they do, but how do we determine how adequate this is? We look to the evidence base. So this is what comes back to what I stated at the beginning around having a research-informed practice or an evidence-informed approach to interventions here. There's the science of sport is relatively new, but the science of performance nutrition it's a newcomer to sport, the whole sports science stable. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a very stark increase in the amount of published literature, empirical data collection, position stands that are available around recommendations for energy, macronutrients, supplements, ergogenics, all related to different athlete types and populations. So you've got to go back to the scientific literature. Now, I'm not expecting any of you to do a systematic literature review. So on one of my very last slides, I have a list of 13, not too many, key papers when it comes to sport and exercise nutrition. And I've referenced some of these throughout the slide deck. So if there are any that you can't access, I'd be happy to provide them as a PDF and they can be sent out to the membership. But that's as many as you need. There are 13 really nice papers there and some additional resources for practitioners that could help. But we're comparing what the athletes tell us they do and what they're hoping to achieve with the scientific literature to ensure that we've got evidence-based, research-informed practice. Now, if we go back to my health versus training and performance analogy that we had earlier on, there are many dietary reference values available for health. That's beyond the scope of what we're going to look at today. But what we're going to compare our athletes' intakes to is position stands or empirical data that's available to optimise performance nutrition in the pursuit of superior sports performance. So this cake that I mentioned at the beginning, the nutrition for health, the reference standards in order to determine nutrition for health, the adequacy of nutrition for health, is the food pyramid. Now, you'll all be aware that the food pyramid has changed in the last number of years, where the bottom two shelves have been flipped. So heretofore, the bottom shelf of the food pyramid, which denoted this is the largest food group that should be comprising your total energy intake in a day, was previously breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices and pastas. And the next shelf up, historically, would have been fruit, veg and salad. That's now flipped. Now, it's flipped to reflect the fact that we have a burdening issue with obesity and weight internationally, but also to reflect that there's a shift in societal norms and we don't have physical activity as part of our daily living to the same extent that we did in the past. So to reflect the obesogenic environment in which we live and the reduction in physical activity as part of daily living, we've had a flip in the bottom two shelves. This isn't always fit for purpose for athletes, but if we're looking at what's the entry-level assessment that you would make on adequacy of a diet for health, this is it, the food pyramid. And now we're going to move on from that because it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of numbers of portions and types of different foods that are available. So let's move on to the interesting stuff, which is around the nutrition strategies for training. The icing on that cake that I mentioned. We're not going to mention fats because fat really has quite a small role. There are specific roles that fat plays in terms of health. You need a specific fat intake in order to ensure that your full biological functions are operating perfectly. But other than that, there isn't a huge amount of fat requirement for sports performance. Arguably, you could say that for open water swimmers, a certain level of adiposity will help buoyancy. Or for collision sports, a certain level of adiposity might help with preventing injuries or as a buffer for collisions. But we're not going to talk at all about fats beyond that today. We're going to focus specifically on carbohydrate and protein and fluids because those are the three that really are more influential in terms of amplifying or reducing the effect of physiological outcomes to training. A quick nod at the outset to energy requirements. It's very, very difficult to accurately determine the energy requirements of an athlete. And what I'm trying to outline with this image that I have in this slide deck here is that there are lots of smaller components that contribute to the total requirement of energy that an athlete or any individual has in any given day. So the total energy requirement that an athlete has is determined by their physical activity from exercise, which is the EXEE, the exercise associated energy expenditure, at the very top of the blue in that image that I'm showing you. The next one down is non-exercise associated physical activity. This is the physical activity that we do every day without it being intentionally exercising. I'm brushing my teeth, I'm sitting at my desk, I'm walking from my office to the canteen, I may even have an active commute in and out to work. So they're all different to exercise associated energy expenditure. This is non-exercise physical activity. And you can see the combined exercise and non-exercise associated physical activity contribute only 10 to 15% of total energy requirements in a day. The diet-induced thermogenesis is the next smaller piece under that, outlined in an orange-red colour. This describes the amount of energy that's required to break down, digest and assimilate food. It's quite a small contribution, so we don't focus too much on that. But you can see that this large green chunk of resting metabolic rate contributes between 60 and 70% to total daily energy requirements. So this is what we focus on when we're looking at trying to predict the energy requirements of an individual. And these are easiest done by predictive equations. Now, I've included at the end a resource that helps you to identify which predictive equation you should use. These predictive equations, in a nutshell, you enter an athlete's age, biological sex, weight and height, and some of them use measures of lean tissue mass. And based on that, there's a predictive equation that gives you an estimate of their resting metabolic rate. And then on top of that, you add in, well, how active are they? Will I apply a factor of 1.2, 1.4, 2.1 to what their resting metabolic rate is to capture their non-exercise physical activity? And then the last part then we're layering is looking at the metabolic equivalents or the MET costs of the training that they've said that they do as part of their food, fluid and activity record that we've asked them to keep. You can see it in very small text there at the top of that slide. There's a reference for O'Neill et al. This is a really nice paper that came out of UCD last year, which looked at which predictive equations are best fit for different athletic types, whether they're team sports, male, female, individual pursuits, combat athletes, rugby players. So there's really nice resources there on which predictive equation you should use for whom, and how then to apply non-exercise associated physical activity or exercise associated energy expenditure requirements to that. Ballpark. Most people say that most women require 1,500 calories and most men require 2,000 calories most of the time. But that does not take into consideration physical activity demands, the exercise associated demands. And dependent on whether you have an athlete who is doing a 100-metre sprint or they're doing the Tour de France, there's going to be a very large spectrum of requirements. And that, what I have outlined there as being 20% of physical activity, can rise by quite a large magnitude dependent on the physical activity pursuits that those athletes are involved in. So step one, what are their energy requirements? We're using predictive equations to compare what they said they eat to what we're calculating their requirements are for energy. But we're going to move far beyond energy requirements only, and we're going to delve into macronutrients. Now, heretofore, the recommendations for macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins and fats, were expressed as a percent contribution of that macronutrient to total daily energy intake. So for argument's sake, we're saying that someone's requirements are 2,000 calories, and based on a healthy diet for sport or a healthy diet for non-athletic cohorts, we're saying that between 50 and 60% of that total energy in a day should be contributed by carbohydrate-based foods. Breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices, pastas, fruit, veg and salad, and some simple sugars. So you can see here that the majority of nutrition should be coming from carbohydrate, complex and fruit, veg and salad. There's a lesser amount coming then from fats, but as I mentioned, we're not going to focus too much on fats. The overall recommendation here would be no greater than 25 to 30% from fat, with different requirements for the monos and polys and unsaturated fats and all of that. But let's focus on protein, whereby the recommendation is that we'd have between 25 and 30% of total daily energy intake coming from protein. Now, this is, if my students in third level handed me this information, this would get them satisfactory or competent. They've got the basics of how do I calculate energy requirements, how do I gather dietary information, and how do I compare it to an evidence base. But this evidence base is for what most people need most of the time. It's quite generic information and it doesn't move beyond what most people require. And really to progress from it being entry-level, satisfactory, competent, because your students are all striving and you are all striving for excellence, what we need to move from is from this % of total daily energy intake for macronutrient recommendations to a personalised, periodised, prescriptive nutrition approach. And this is all based on body mass. So we're now not just prescribing absolute amounts, you need so much % or you need so many grams of carbohydrate. We're recommending macronutrients based on grams per kilogram of body mass per day or per hour. So obviously to do this, athletes need to know, or your students will need to know, what somebody's body mass is. And an obvious question here would be, well, what if we're dealing with an individual who's not at their ideal body composition? Are we prescribing based on their current body mass, or do you prescribe based on their intended or their ideal body mass? You can do either. I think for the purposes of Leaving Cert physical education, I think if you were to go on their current body mass, and then we can speak a little bit further about whether they're trying to lose, maintain or gain weight. So best practice would be that you have a measure of body mass, and based on that you can prescribe grams of carbohydrates or proteins per unit of body mass, so relative to body mass, either on a daily basis or on an hourly basis. Now this needs to tie in with their anthropometry, their diet that they've already recorded and given to you, the physical activity that they've outlined that they do or that they intend to do, and what their aims and objectives are with all of that. So the ABCDEI of the Nutritional Assessment and the frequency, intensity, timing and type for the assessment of physical activity all should inform this prescriptive movement from generic to periodised and personalised. And the easiest way to do this is one of my alphabetic spaghetti pieces from the front, is using quantity, quality, distribution and timing. So when it comes to carbohydrates and proteins and fluids, we're going to focus over the next couple of slides on quantity. How much do I need? The quality, how do we determine the quality of different macronutrients, whether it's carbohydrates or proteins? And the distribution and timing, the timing over the time span of a day from when you rise to when you go to bed, but also the distribution relative to a training stimulus. And should that distribution differ dependent on what the training stimulus is? So we're going to look at carbohydrates now and also proteins in the context of quantity, quality, distribution and timing. Again, there's an assumption here that we're not quite at the I don't know what a tracker mortgage is level. I'm assuming that everyone knows what carbohydrates and proteins are, but just to have it on the record, carbohydrates are breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices, pastas, fruit and veg and salad, and also simple sugars. So things that you get in sports drinks or table sugars or gels, things like that. Proteins are meat, fish, chicken, eggs and cheese, peas, beans, lentils, and there's an emergence of many alternative sources of protein for the general population as well as for athletes. But for our purposes here, animal or plant-based products are what we're going to focus on, and fats we're not too focused on for today. So let's jump straight in then to carbohydrates. I think one of the questions that I've seen on past exam papers were, what's the primary function of? The primary function for carbohydrates in a sports context is it's the preferred fuel for exercising muscle. So the primary role is to fuel muscle contraction, which is for locomotion, getting from A to B, for a breaking ball, lifting, sprinting, generating power. All of those things will primarily and preferentially use carbohydrates as a fuel source. So when my athletes or my students even would ask me, well, what's the danger in not having carbohydrate? If you've taken out the primary and preferred fuel source and you now have to use not the preferable fuel source, the danger is fatigue. Early fatigue is the main outcome of not having adequately fueled from a carbohydrate perspective. So the role of carbohydrate in sports performance is to fuel muscle contraction and to fuel all the activities, and the absence of carbohydrate or suboptimal carbohydrate intake will result in earlier fatigue or increased rates of perceived exertion. I think one of the other points that often comes up is, particularly in the context of the percent contribution of carbohydrate to total daily intake, what does that mean in terms of grams of carbohydrate? To do that, your students will need to do a little bit of maths around it. Carbohydrates have 4 calories in a gram. So your students would need to be able to back calculate or even calculate forward. If they consume 2,000 calories and we're saying 50% of it should come from carbohydrates, how many gram amounts is that? And then how does that compare to commonly consumed foods? So that information might be helpful for students as well, 4 calories in a gram of carbohydrates. So we're looking now here at what looks like quite a complex slide. It's from two absolute key researchers in sport and exercise nutrition, Louise Burke and John Hawley. They've been working for decades in the Australian Institute of Sport and in physiology and nutrition with academic institutions in Australia. They're by far the key opinion leaders, and you'll see at the end of the slide deck some of their work is referenced in the bibliography that I've recommended. And it was this powerhouse of Hawley and Burke who originally had decided that we should move from generic one-size-fits-all approaches to more prescriptive advice along a continuum of how much do you need when it comes to carbohydrate. Now, when it comes to carbohydrate, you will see, and this is sometimes a challenge when you're teaching, particularly at third level institutions where we're recommending independent learning and review of the literature, students can come back with anything between 3 and 5 grams per kilogram body mass per day, all the way up to 8 to 12 grams per kilogram body mass per day as a recommended intake for carbohydrate. And all of them would be correct because it depends on the context and on the athlete and on the discipline that's being undertaken, the duration of exercise. So this is where the frequency, intensity, timing and type of activity really determine the amount of carbohydrate that's required. Now, broadly speaking, you can see here that the type of activity, low intensity exercises or skill-based activities, require between 3 and 5 grams per kilograms of body mass per day, all the way through to extreme commitment or extreme exertion, whereby we're looking at 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of an athlete's body weight per day in carbohydrate-based foods. The frequency with which an athlete needs to redo or perform or repeat an activity also needs to be considered here, because if we're looking at a 100-metre sprinter, it's important to remember that just because they compete in a 100-metre sprint on the track in Paris for the Olympics, their training paradigm is not just that they only ever run 10 seconds at a time. There will be days that they do endurance, there'll be days that they do tempo, there'll be days that they do strength. So considering an athlete by the discipline in which they compete is quite an outdated view when it comes to performance nutrition. And we're moving now towards this understanding that you may be a sprinter, you may be a marathon runner, you may be a boxer, but along all of the different training that you do in any type of macro cycle, you will have all of the different nutrition requirements based on the training that's done. So looking at training and nutrition complementary and in parallel allow us to periodise and personalise this approach. Now, I'm not sure if for Leaving Cert this might be a step too far. It might be enough to say you're a team-based athlete, it's 5 to 7 grams. You're doing the Ross around Ireland on a bike, it's 8 to 12 grams. But within that, the Gold Star students should be able to say, but there should be variability across the 4 days that we've asked them to record, a rest day, a training day, a competition day and a weekend day. You would not like them to be eating 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate on a rest day. You'd like to see athletes know enough to be able to self-select, or with guidance, that a practitioner could prescribe different levels along this continuum of between 3 to 5 up to 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body mass per day, dependent on the activity that's being undertaken on any given day. So Asker Jukendrup is quite a famous researcher in carbohydrate, was where he did an awful lot of his pivotal work. And he's developed 2 nice infographics, which I'm going to show you on this in the next slide, which speak not only to the quantity of carbohydrate that's required, dependent on the duration and the type of exercise, but also a little nod to quality, which we'll move on to in a moment. So you can see here that dependent on whether the duration of exercise is up to 30 to 75 minutes, all the way up to greater than 2.5 or 3 hours, the amount that's required on an hourly basis. So we've progressed now from looking at what you need on a daily basis to looking specifically at a training stimulus and saying, right, we're exercising for 2 hours. We may have said that we need 5 to 7 grams per kilogram body mass per day, but how do we optimally fuel this discrete training stimulus? It's 2 to 3 hours, we need roughly 60 grams. And you can see here in the middle panel, it speaks to the requirement for single or multiple transportable carbohydrates. Now this is definitely higher level, and there's no need for your students or you to know too much about this, but essentially, when you're looking at gels or sports drinks, you'll see that an awful lot of the labels now say contains multiple blends or contains poly blends of carbohydrates. And this speaks to the quality of the carbohydrate, but also the ease with which it can be transported from the gut into the circulatory system to be transported where it needs to get to. the easiest way to try and explain it is that there's multiple gates and channels that these single transportable carbohydrates can move through. And if you use just all type 1, those gates become saturated very quickly. But we've got lots of different gates. So if we have sucrose, fructose, glucose, all those gates can be opening and closing at different rates. And it allows a higher uptake of carbohydrate within a short space of time. And again, tries to ensure that those levels of carbohydrate that are circulating and stored are topped up. The next slide presents the same information in a slightly different way. I was trying to ensure that, dependent on learner types, that we'd have difference. So on the bottom of that graph, you can see that between 0 all the way up to 3 hours. So we're again looking at the requirement per hour for a discrete training session rather than per day. And it addresses the small amounts that might be required all the way through to 90 grams per hour that might be required through these multiple transportable carbohydrates. So we've spoken now about the quantity of carbohydrate that's required either in total daily energy intake percentages, 50 to 60, on a gram per kilogram body mass per day, starting at an absolute minimum of 3 and all the way upwards to 12 or more, dependent on the physical activity that the individual is engaged with. And we've looked at a discrete training session. Is it longer than 2.5 hours, or is it shorter than 35 minutes? And how much carbohydrate is required within that? And we're moving on now to look at the quality. So I mentioned already that you can determine the quality of carbohydrates by where they come from. So are they complex carbohydrates, like fibrous material, breads, breakfast cereals and pastas? Or are they more simple carbohydrates, like the sugars that you'd get in table sugar or in sports drinks? And without getting too detailed on this, the easiest way to determine the quality of carbohydrates is by their glycemic index. And the glycemic index describes how, when you consume carbohydrate-based foods, how quickly we see that rate of appearance of the sugar in your bloodstream. So for any of you who have partners who've had babies, or if you've had babies yourself, if you're looking at blood glucose tolerance tests or glucose loads tests, so when you have to consume a high amount of sugar in a drink, such as Lucozade Sport, and then you either do finger prick tests or you do blood tests to see how quickly does that blood sugar appear in the bloodstream having consumed those high carbohydrate-based foods. And foods can either be categorised as low glycemic index, and you can see in the pie chart or the dial that I have on the slide here that low glycemic index foods are generally foods that are high in fibre or have a protein or a fat content. And then high glycemic index foods, denoted by the red here, are generally simple sugars. They can also be tubers, so vegetables and things that grow below ground can sometimes have a high sugar content as well. So it isn't necessarily a case that high glycemic index is bad and low glycemic index is good, because it completely depends on our context. The easiest way to describe this is with an example of a match day meal plan. So I think this is one of the things that students are often asked to do, to put together what you would put on a plate before a match, or span a time that you would get from when you wake up in the morning until you go to bed at night when you've got a competition in the middle of the day. Now you can see here that this prescribed match day meal plan has about 50% carbohydrate on the plate, with the remaining 25% split between fruit, veg, salad and lean proteins. But if you look in detail at the blue circle towards the bottom, it says high glycemic index, high fibre and low fat for the carbohydrate-based foods. There's often a misunderstanding when it comes to why high glycemic index is important, or why we would be recommending it. Low glycemic index-based foods are browns, wholemeal, whole grain, high fibre. They're the foods that generally we're recommending for most people most days. But they have a slow release of the energy that they contain. Now, for a pre-match meal, we don't want a slow release. We want the energy that we consume to be available 3 hours, 60 to 90 minutes, whatever it is, after we've consumed it. Because it's not much good having a release of energy when you're on your way home on the bus later on. So in pre-match meals or pre-events, when we've already spoken about the quantity of carbohydrate and we're now moving on to the quality, there is a preference for high glycemic index, low fibre carbohydrate-based foods in order to have easily digestible and readily available energy during or just immediately pre or post an event. Now this is sometimes at odds, or oftentimes at odds, with what the general healthy eating guidelines are, where we're recommending that people have high fibre, wholemeal, whole grain, brown options. But for pre-event, we're flipping that and we're moving towards whites, low fibre, easily digestible, in order to ensure a readily available source of carbohydrate in particular to fuel training. And again, this is all down to contracting muscles, fueling performance, and trying to prevent fatigue. So we're going to move on now to protein, but to wrap up on carbohydrate, we've looked at percent of total daily energy intake to quantify how much is required. We've progressed that to look at the grams per kilogram body mass per day along athlete descriptors, and we've moved it on again to look at bespoke to an individual training session, dependent on the frequency, intensity, timing and type, how much carbohydrate, the quantity you need in an hour or longer. And then we've spoken about the quality of the carbohydrate and how the glycemic index should be used to determine the availability of the carbohydrate relative to a training stimulus. Now we're going to do the very same when it comes to protein. And protein, again, when you look at what's the function of it, the function for a protein is generally growth, repair, maturation and development. And in a sports context, the easiest way to describe this is that everything that you can see on your forearm, your skin, hair, nails, your everything that you can see that's underneath, your muscles, your ligaments, your tendons and your bones, they're all made from protein. And we're in a constant state of flux and repair. And one of the key opinion leaders when it comes to protein metabolism for health, but in particular for athletes, is a Dutch researcher called Luc van Loon. And oftentimes at his research symposiums, he would say, take a look at your forearm, everything that you can see and everything that you can't see. And in 12 weeks' time, you'll have a brand new arm. Now, what that's supposed to describe for people is that the constant state of turnover that we have for proteins, and that then speaks to the requirement we have for protein in order to generate growth, repair, regeneration. And the more physically active you are, the more upregulated this process of turnover is. So the whole process of exercise itself, people generally assume that it's anabolic in that it promotes growth, but it can also be quite catabolic in that it promotes breakdown. And the way to balance that out and to square the circle is to ensure from a nutrition perspective that you've got enough to prevent excess catabolism or breakdown and to promote enough anabolism or growth and regeneration. So for that reason, the primary role of protein is to provide the building blocks for muscle protein synthesis, for health and for athletic performance. Similarly to carbohydrates, we've got 4 calories in a gram. Again, this might be helpful for students when they're calculating how much in absolute terms the protein content should be relative to total daily energy intake. And as I mentioned previously, the recommendation on a total daily energy intake percent contribution should be in or around 10 or 15%. Now this again is on a continuum, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. So Stu Phillips is a Canadian researcher and again probably one of the key opinion leaders when it comes to protein requirements for health and for performance. And we're looking specifically here at the relative amounts of protein that are required relative to body mass for different athlete types. So the same steps that we did previously for carbohydrate. How much do we need on grams per kilogram body mass per day? And this is expressed in terms of the RDA, which is the recommended daily allowance. And there's a continuum here all the way up from 0.8 grams per kilogram body mass per day up to 2 grams per kilogram body mass per day. And in some research papers, you can see values of upwards of 2.4 grams per kilogram body mass per day, but we don't see any additional benefit for hypertrophy or strength generation beyond 2.4 grams per kilogram body mass per day. Now, just to put it in context, it's all very straightforward for me. Most Irish people, without making any effort at all, as long as you're not vegan or vegetarian, get 1 gram per kilogram body mass per day. So if you weigh 70 kilos, most people eat 70 grams of protein without there being any specific effort to achieve that. So most people meet their requirements for protein on a quantity basis. But again, we're going to progress this to look at the quality of the protein and then the distribution and the timing specifically relative to a training stimulus. You can see here, same as what we had for carbohydrate, where we were moving from 3 to 5 up to 8 to 12. The continuum here is denoted by the type of physical activity, primarily in which the athlete is engaged. So endurance athletes have 1.4, upwards to 1.7 for strength or team-based sports, and again up to 2 for strength training or resistance. If we move on then to look at protein quality, the protein quality has become something that people are referring to an awful lot more. And it's the protein quality is described by the constituent amino acids that are in a protein containing food. If we were to look at protein under a microscope, it would almost look like a string of pearls, that there are multiple single amino acids that are joined together. And looking at them as a single amino acid component or as a string of amino acids determines what their functionality is. And in order for a protein to be described as being high biological value or of high protein content, we would like it to be what we describe as complete. That all of the amino acids, whether they're essential, non-essential or conditionally essential, are present in that food. And the foods which we see as being lower quality proteins don't contain all of those individual amino acids in the levels that are required to promote health or to prevent ill health or to support training outcomes. For yourselves as teachers, but for your students in particular, because the whole parlance of protein supplements and supplementation is, and not just the parlance of it, but the practice of it is so commonplace now. If students are asked to look at products and to see if they can figure out whether it has a branched chain amino acid content, a BCAA, and what this means and why it's important, this could be a good learning exercise in terms of figuring out the protein quality. So BCAAs, or branched chain amino acids, are particularly potent in terms of switching on metabolic processes that upregulate muscle protein synthesis. And in particular, the one that I've listed on the slide deck here, leucine, is probably the most important when it comes to muscle protein synthesis. So protein quantity, somewhere between 0.8 grams and 2.4 grams per kilogram body mass per day, determined by discipline. And then the protein quality, we're looking for a balance of amino acids across the different food types that are consumed. Now, the easiest way to describe the quality of protein is based on the source. So animal products have a higher quality because they have more amino acid constituent pieces. Plant-based proteins, which have become quite popular, and rightly so from a sustainability perspective, are often described as lower quality or incomplete proteins because they're deficient in one or more amino acids. Now, what you're looking for from an athletic performance to assess the quality of a diet is that most of the protein that's consumed is coming from an animal source, or which has a high biological value, or if you've got athletes who are vegan or vegetarian, that they're combining things like quinoa with rice or peas with lentils in order to find the missing amino acids and to have them in a full complement of food. This is probably getting a little bit more detail than what's required, but if your students can say quantity and now moving on to quality, and even if it's just top line stuff like animal is better than plant, and then moving in then for your A grade students to BCAAs, branched chain amino acids and leucine and the role that they play, that would be really fantastic. So we've looked at protein quantity, quality, and now we're looking at timing. I mentioned previously that most of the Irish population who are not vegan or vegetarian, who follow typical Western type diets, achieve adequacy in protein quantity. They get enough over the course of the day. But if we look at the timing or the distribution, you can see that the one on the left, which is denoted, or maybe it's on your right, the green one, whereby there's an uneven distribution and a significant bias in protein consumption at the main evening meal. What this is supposed to try and depict is that most people get some protein at breakfast, a little bit more at their lunch, but by far the largest amount that they get is for their main evening meal. And this is not optimal. So the orange band that you see running across depicts between 20 and 30 grams, which literature has informed us is optimal in terms of the bolus of protein that's required spread across between 3, 4 or 5 eating occasions over the course of a day. So what most people do is have insufficient at breakfast, just about enough at lunch, and then a very large bolus in their evening meal, which isn't optimally distributed. And what we would like to see, and what your students should be trying to encourage athletes to achieve, is a more nuanced approach to try and ensure adequacy, not just at the evening meal, but across each of the individual eating occasions. So between 20 and 30 gram amounts at breakfast, lunch, dinner. And then this graph here is specifically for non-athletic cohorts. When you layer in a performance stimulus, so whether it's a strength training session or a pitch session, you at least would like to see one further eating occasion. And then some researchers would say, well, then you'd also need to see another pre-bed snack. So the frequency of eating for optimal protein feeding would be 5 eating occasions in the day, each providing between 20 and 30 grams of protein. Now the why on this is, this level of protein provides the right, how to describe it without getting too saucy, it achieves a level of hyperaminoacidemia, the right amount of amino acids in the bloodstream that switch on metabolic processes that help to upregulate anabolism and prevent catabolism. So by having this optimal distribution, you're achieving sufficiency with proteins in your bloodstream that switch on these mechanisms to accrue muscle and to prevent muscle loss associated with exercise. Now the research that's done in this, the dose response research, some of the researchers are listed there at the bottom in the position paper from Thomas et al. What we were looking at is how much is required in order to achieve sufficiency by looking at the levels of rises of amino acids in bloodstreams. And between 0.25 and 0.33 grams per kilogram body mass per eating occasion. So we've moved on now again, the same as we've done with carbohydrates, from per day to per hour. And now we've moved with protein from per day to per eating occasion, between 0.25 and 0.33. And dependent on whether an athlete is front row forward at 130 kilos or a basketball player or a volleyball player at 60 kilos, using this 0.25 grams per kilogram body mass, the figure of somewhere between 15 and 30, which is why this recommendation for 20 grams for most athletes most of the time achieve sufficiency has emerged. Okay. This recommendation that I spoke about of the between 4 bolus feeds, so breakfast, lunch, dinner and around training of 20 grams, can be again augmented by the inclusion of between 20 and 40 grams before bed. This again might be a step too far for leaving Cert PE, but the thinking here is that, well, the science here is that over a period of fasting, so without the stimulus of either nutrition or training, you can fall into a catabolic state that you're more breaking muscle down than accruing it. And the consumption of slow release proteins, so for those of you who are involved in sport or take supplements anyway, casein based products, so these would be slower release proteins than what you'd get in a whey based product, consuming that at an amount of 20 to 40 grams before bed is thought to drip feed protein slowly while you're asleep and to prevent breakdown. Now this is really fine art stuff, you know, if somebody is skipping breakfast and is having fast food, this isn't going to have any effect, but where everything else is optimized, these small margins can make a difference. So now we've completed quantity, quality, distribution and timing for carbohydrates and proteins, and we're going to move on to speak briefly about fluids. And the easiest way to describe how underestimated fluids are when it comes to sports performance is to ask whether or not any athletes would be interested in a product that was free, no cost associated with it, widely available, had no or very low risks to health or performance, had no risks of incurring any doping or anti-doping violations, and was pretty much guaranteed to improve health and performance. Who would be interested? And of course, everyone is interested and they're thinking that there's some new secret magic ingredient that's available, but it's as simple as hydration status and trying to acknowledge how the decrements to performance associated with being poorly hydrated and how you can optimize performance with being adequately hydrated. So as little as 2% dehydration can significantly impair performance, particularly where athletes are performing in the heat. And the reason that this decrement to performance is observed is because of the increased physiological stress that's placed on cardiovascular systems, metabolic systems, and the resultant impact that this has on things like cognitive function, eye-hand coordination, response rates, and in turn then, dependent on the level of dehydration, how this can affect hydration status, the ability to thermoregulate, the prevalence of things like heat shock or heat illnesses, all are determined by hydration status, which is something that's so easily and often overlooked. What you're looking at on this chart is on the bottom, the levels of dehydration. So 0 is you're not dehydrated at all, you're adequately hydrated. And on the vertical axis, we're looking at maximum performance. So when any individual on any given day is not dehydrated to any extent, here, their performance should be at 100%. Now that doesn't mean they're all of a sudden a superstar. All it means is that they're performing to the best of their own individual ability. Now when we move here to 2% dehydrated, it's only at about 2% dehydration that we have a perception of thirst. And you can see that athletes can have dropped by as much as 30% of their performance, of them at their best in an adequately hydrated state. And at 5% dehydration, which is quite easily achieved in an average training session, there can be a decrement to performance of a magnitude of 30%, arising from decreased blood flow, difficulty with heat regulation, cardiovascular strain, all of those things. So how do we prevent this, I suppose, is the question. The easiest way, and this is again, it can be a task that athletes can, or that students can do in class, is to look at measuring sweat rates and to look at measuring the changes to body mass that are experienced between the beginning and the end of an exercise session. Now, ill-informed athletes or ill-informed students, I'm sure none of you have those, might assume that if you have a weight change from 104 kilos to 101 kilos from the beginning to an end of a session, that they might have lost fat mass. Of course, there isn't any change in fat mass over 60 to 90 minutes. The change in body mass that's observed with training is all down to fluid balance. And we lose fluids through inhalation and exhalation, through sweat rates, through evaporation, and all of these things can impact, as I've shown you on the previous slide, performance. So things like looking at changes to body mass from baseline through to the end of an exercise session, and then calculating percent changes in body mass, can not only identify for students the importance of doing this, but also can determine the requirement for fluid in recovery. So you can see the last point on this slide states that for every 1 kilogram change in body mass, it needs to be replaced by 1.5 times that of fluid in litres. So if you have 1 kg change, you're looking at 1.5 litres of fluid. If you've got 3 kg or 4 kg changes, we've identified on this slide, it's quite a large volume of fluid. Now, in an ideal world, what you're trying to ensure is that there is no change. That if we're looking at the fluid requirements before, during and post, we want athletes to begin a training session euhydrated, adequately hydrated. And then if they've been coached and practiced enough consuming beverages during training, there really shouldn't be that much change from the beginning to an end of a session. And you're not then expecting them to have very large volumes in order to recover. So those requirements are on the next slides. I'll just mention first, anywhere that I work as an applied practitioner, I hang these P charts. And I would do this even for schools teams, whether it's Harty Cup or Junior Cup or Senior Cup rugby. The easiest way for athletes to know whether or not they're well or poorly hydrated is to monitor the urine status. And when your urine is dark in colour, strong in smell, or low in volume, it's the easiest way for athletes to identify their own personal hydration status. So what you're aiming for athletes is that their urine should be not strong smelling, high in volume, and straw coloured. And any deviation from that, or for athletes who are tracking regularly, any deviation from that should be a flag that maybe further investigations of urine osmolality or different tests to assess hydration status are necessary. But for LCPE purposes, if students were advising athletes to monitor urine output, urine scent and urine colour using established P charts, it's a very good gauge for how much they require. So in terms of the requirements for pre, during and post fluids, there are very specific guidances around, and there are many different position stands on fluid requirements. This is from quite an old paper back in 2011 that looked at the requirements of most athletes most of the time. And you can see here that it doesn't just include water. There's an addition of sodium for exercise that's longer than a certain duration. There's an addition of carbohydrates, whereby we're layering the information we have from the previous slides. We need carbohydrate, we also need fluid. Let's put them all together and add in electrolytes to kill a couple of birds with one stone. But you can see the specific requirements here for the amount of fluid that's required before, during or after exercise in order to initially avoid dehydration, and then where dehydration occurs to recover appropriately from it. Okay, we're moving towards the end of my slide deck now, and I am going to move on to try and putting it all together. So when it comes to the carbohydrates, proteins and fluids that we've mentioned, They shouldn't ever be considered in isolation. I've explained them all in isolation here, but if we can find products, foods that contain protein, carbohydrates and fluids and electrolytes all in one, that would be the best approach. And for, I know there's another element to the Leaving Cert PE curriculum that looks at ergogenics, but the mantra for sport and exercise nutrition is food first. That we're trying to achieve adequacy in terms of what you eat on a daily basis and then what you eat around an exercise stimulus from a food first approach. Now, where you cannot or will not achieve adequacy through food first, there's an addition to that mantra that goes, but not food only. That there is space for supplements, but only when you've exhausted it from a food first perspective. The requirement then for food here is looking at before exercise, the priorities are going to be fluids and carbohydrates. During exercise, those same requirements persist, with fluids and carbohydrates being the mainstays. And then after exercise, we're switching slightly to recovery, and the addition of protein is included in there. Now, these are required where exercise is longer than 60 minutes in duration, and where the intent of the individual who's exercising is to optimize performance. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's an exercises medicine program, and we're looking at people post-cardiovascular event who are trying to lose weight, or type 2 diabetics who are trying to manage weight and glycemic management better. Clearly, we're not going to be recommending carbohydrate during exercise that's less than 60 minutes in duration in that context. But for athletic cohorts, fluids across the board for pre, during, post, carbohydrates across the board for pre, during, post, and a prioritisation of protein in recovery after exercise. I have 3 slides here that have citations included, which again are on one of my last slides, that give you summary information or a kind of a cheat sheet that goes through what's the primary reason for including this macronutrient or this nutrient in an athletic diet, what's the energetic cost of it, and what are the recommendations for pre, during and post, along with some pivotal papers. Don't forget that the translation of this from the needs-based analysis, for students, if they're able to talk about quantity, quality, distribution and timing, pre, during and post, all of that information is here in this slide deck, but just to try and frame it in a way that they can remember and what the process is: a needs-based assessment, compare it to normative reference values or to the scientific literature, prescribed based on total daily energy intake, prescribed based on grams per kilogram body mass over a day, prescribed based on grams per kilogram body mass per hour, dependent on the exercise stimulus. And what we need to consider then is, so that's for carbohydrate, a similar one here for protein, follow the same steps: quantity, quality, distribution and timing. And a similar one for fluids, same process: quantity, quality, distribution and timing, pre, during and post, with citations. But what we've got to remember is that most athletes don't really read scientific literature, and grams per kilogram body mass per day is quite difficult for them to put into practice. So there's a certain amount of science, there's a significant amount of science in terms of the recommendation for nutrition to support health and performance. But then there's definitely an art form and the softer side to nutrition, dietetics or practice, where you're trying to ensure that they know not just what they eat and why they should eat it, but how they do it on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to finish up with some of those. Okay. How do you translate theory to practice? How do you ensure that athletes know that they can pick up the messaging that you've given them? So from a theory perspective, grams per kilogram body mass per day works, but really high-level students should be then able to say, what this means based on the diet that you've given me at the beginning is, I notice that you're not having any protein at your breakfast. The literature says that you should be having 20 grams, reference Stu Phillips. For that reason, I am recommending that you add 1 pot of high-protein yogurt to your Weetabix in the morning, and this will augment your protein intake to 20 grams, and you've achieved sufficiency. So this translation of science to practice can be very challenging for inexperienced practitioners, and often for students, they miss that final step. I've told you what you need to do, off you go. But this translation of science to practice and the difference between science and art when it comes to athlete education, and mindful of the preferences of the individual. So the ABCDEI approach, where you've identified from a dietary perspective if there are preferences, food avoidances, any kind of things related to food. You don't want to recommend that somebody has liver and mackerel if there are foods that they're never going to eat. So Being mindful of the likes and the dislikes of the athlete, and then looking to see how you can translate this from grams per kilogram body mass per day to food-based recommendations is extremely important. There are resources that I can make available to the PEAI members if you thought it would be useful that look at meal building. So dependent on the recommendations that you have for quantity, quality and distribution of different macronutrients, what ready reckoners can you use that would allow students to say that has 50 grams of carbohydrates, that is 25 grams of protein, and they can often be helpful for students in putting the science into practice. Knowing the goals of the athlete is extremely important, and this comes back to what I mentioned at the beginning with the context and the intent. So where these recommendations are, we've moved now from a generic one-size-fits-all to a periodised, personalised, individualised approach, but there still has to be some variation in there, dependent on where we are in the phase of training, what the intents and the context of the athlete are. So if we revisit this alphabetic spaghetti that I had at the beginning, where I was saying that you should now be able to make sense of this, maybe I'll have to refer back to some of the slide deck, but I would be hopeful at this stage that you would have better confidence or competencies around a nutritional assessment, which is denoted by A, B, C, D, E, I. Anthropometry, biochemistry, clinical assessment, dietary assessment, which has been our focus of today, and exercise assessment, and knowing the intents and the context for the athlete. To do the dietary assessment, you're looking at a food, fluid and activity record. So what I spoke about from a gold standard perspective was the prospective food record for an individual, and something like MyFitnessPal or indeed a paper record using Excel would be absolutely fine. And mindful of the importance of the parallel assessment of nutrition and physical activity, frequency, intensity, timing and type. And sometimes it can be useful to add in, when you're looking at frequency, intensity, timing and type, an RPE, a rate of perceived exertion for the athlete, as to how hard did they find that session, how fueled did they feel they were. We moved on then to look at quantity, quality, distribution and timing of carbohydrates, proteins and fluids. And we've moved from this one-size-fits-all total daily energy intake percent to prescribing relative to body mass per day or per hour, dependent on whether we're looking at what an athlete's needs are by discipline or by an individual training stimulus. And then we looked at the comparative standards, so the literature that's available that tells us what good looks like, how much is required, when is it required, the dose response stuff that we looked at, protein, the multiple transportable carbohydrates, from Asker Ukendrup. And then I've provided those summary slides at the end that look at what are the summary guidances on optimizing carbohydrate, protein and fluid intakes, the priorities and the gram, the sources of them for pre, during and post exercise. So I really hope that has given you sufficient information that you feel better armed and confident teaching students for the curriculum. I'd like to finish by outlining where I think you should get and where I would prefer you not to get further information when it comes to performance nutrition. It's become the most popular theme on bro science and with influencers. Anybody who eats thinks that they have something to add to the discussion and to the arguments around optimal nutrition. A pal of mine who is Professor Sharon Madigan, she works in the Sport Ireland Institute, she's always said that you should not take advice from a topless influencer. Generally, they're not going to have the same level of qualifications and expertise as a registered practitioner. So for that reason, I'm going to point you to some resources online that are extremely helpful for teaching LCPE students, for teaching third level institution students, but also for educating athletes. So these are resources that are devised either by practitioners from the Register for Sport and Exercise Nutrition or for the Irish Nutrition and Dietetic Institute. They're freely available either through the National Dairy Council, Sport Ireland or Safe Food. You can contact them and ask them to send you PDFs or hard copies. And this last slide here identifies some further places that you can find reputable evidence-based research-informed practice. So whether it's through the IRFU or the Irish Nutrition Dietetic Institute, I've mentioned the Australian Institute of Sport, their website is there. They've always been to the fore when it comes to sport and exercise nutrition. I want to give a nod as well to GSSI, so the Gatorade Sports Science Institute have recently launched a toolbox through the Gatorade Sports Science Institute University, which I think teachers and students will find extremely helpful. It gives you resources for dietary assessment, how to interpret it, how to prescribe more prescriptively, more specifically. So I think that would be a really valuable resource. And the last website that I've nodded to there is not related to this context, but more to Clean Sport, which is another theme on the Leaving Cert PE, which helps students to identify principles of clean sport. You can get a certification in it through the Informed Sports websites. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Catherine, thanks a million for all that. That's super informative there. I'm sure people want to go back over that a couple of times just to pick out the various nuances that they might want to dig into a bit more detail based on what their students want. A couple of questions I have are kind of more clarification points on some of the bits you touched on there before we go into questions that came from people that submitted in advance. Just around the calculations around carbohydrates based on the athlete and their particular size. Let's just take, for example, and we had in the 6 to 10 grams per kg of body weight for over an hour of somewhat intense exercise. So that could take, say, a typical GA session with some small sided games in it, some runs, whatever you might be doing. So take, for example, me, I'm around 80 kg. I would be looking then at, multiply that by 6, I'm talking 480 grams of carbohydrate over the course of the day around that. Whereas someone who's a good bit smaller than me, maybe 60 kg, they're looking at 360 grams. Is that what we're looking at there? It's not a one size fits all total amount, it's per body weight.
Absolutely. Yeah, so rather than having a percent of your total energy intake, or rather than having a one size fits all, it's relative to body mass. So if you remember, the primary role for carbohydrate is for locomotion, to fuel contracting muscle. The larger you are, it should follow that you've got a larger musculature, so that you require more fuel to get that musculature contracting for physical activity. So it stands to reason that those who are larger are going to have greater requirements than those who are smaller.
And around the protein intake and the recommendations there, we had on one end of the continuum the strength training 2 grams per kg of body weight and endurance to 1.4. Now if you are an endurance athlete or a field-based athlete who does strength training as part of their overall program, does that bring you up closer towards the 2 grams per kg of body weight?
And this is like when I was in university, or when I graduated as a practitioner, there were books on shelves that were nutrition for marathon running. And it made the assumption that because you did a marathon in Dublin in October, that you ran a marathon every day and that you should have very high levels of carbohydrate and minimise protein intake nearly every single day. But exactly as you've stated, the thinking and the acceptance now is that people have multiple modalities of training within a day, within a training week. And really the top level athletes and the top level practitioners should be informing their athletes and educating them that they should be eating differently on any given day within a training paradigm, which is why with things like the food record and the food and activity record, where you're keeping it for 4 days to get differences in today I'm on a pitch, tomorrow I'm in the gym, and ultimately you're moving for an athlete from, right, you have enough protein there, but you don't have enough for this day. So instead of having this much at breakfast time, can you have a snack before you go in that has this amount? So there should be almost exactly as you said, this spectrum of this is how much you need on a day, dependent on who you are. But then within each of those days, when you've got different training modalities, your diet should be changed to reflect that, because you're trying to influence different physiological outcomes from training.
Good, yeah. And the 4 days you said were most part there was a training day, a rest day, a competition day and a weekend day, yeah.
Yeah, so for non-athletic cohorts it would be 2 plus 2, so 2 weekdays and 2 weekend days. And then for athletic populations, you're trying to make sure that you've got the full complement of the different days that they might have in there.
And just last one based off your presentation there was around the fluid loss, and that for every kg you lose of fluid, you want is it 1.2, 1.5 litres for that?
Exactly, yeah.
And if you're trained in the PM, are there potential negatives on your sleep thereof? You know, you train at 7:30, you get off the pitch at 9 and you drink 1.5 litres to 2 water. Like, is there, like, should you be, I suppose, more proactive earlier in the day or throughout training as opposed to leaving it afterwards to drink that much before you go to sleep?
It's a great question, and it really echoes the sentiment that I expressed earlier on of the translation of science to practice and the art that comes into dietary practices. The theory books say this is what you should do, but then you've got to decide with an athlete, well, what's more important, a good night's sleep or making sure that you're adequately hydrated? So it comes then down to working with the athlete to figure out the priorities. Now, just to repeat what I had said, ultimately you're hoping that there will not be 3 kilos of fluid loss from the beginning to an end of a session. And you could nearly, as a practitioner, state that you haven't done your job properly if athletes are losing that magnitude of weight from the beginning to an end, unless you're in a very high environment at a very high intensity for a very long duration. But ultimately, if athletes start with less than 1 to 2% body weight change, that's easily recoverable. And what you're trying to do, is exactly as you've said, John, is front load fluid intakes. And that if you feel, particularly for athletes who feel that it interfere with sleep, to try and ensure that you don't have a huge amount of fluids to recover with post-exercise.
Some questions then that came in advance were submitted on the Instagram. They're largely related to the PAP, but we'll answer them in kind of a broader sense and see how we can apply them back. Just when it comes to doing that analysis, particularly for your section A of your PAP, you mentioned MyFitnessPal, but even are there any other apps you can look at that people could use? But also, what are some things to be aware of when you're using an app like that, particularly around the potential recommendations the app might make, but also potential inaccuracies of using it?
Sure. The good news is that technology is really influencing practice and data collection when it comes to performance nutrition. So there are lots and lots of apps available, but as your question suggests, there are some caveats that come with them. So the gold standard methods for assessing dietary intakes would be using, it's a research grade performance analysis tool called Nutritic. Now you can get free week-long subscriptions that give you a taster of it, but ultimately there's lots of Me Too's then that are quite similar to Nutritic, but the difference is they're not research grade and they're updated by the community of users. So what I mean by that is, if you had a product for breakfast this morning that wasn't available in MyFitnessPal, you can scan the barcode on it or you can enter the nutritional information yourself. But let's say you had fat fingers and you put in 300 instead of 30. Nobody has oversight on that. Nobody checks it to say, there couldn't be 300 grams of protein in a product that only weighs 50 grams. So the next time I go in and I say, I had that product that John ate, and I just click that, there's nobody that can check it to say there's a mistake in that data entry. Now you can sometimes with some of the apps turn off the listings of products that are updated by the community, and you can only use the ones that have come from manufacturers, but it takes a bit of settings manipulation to try and do all that. So there are some issues with them. The other really important one to point out, and it's quite topical, is the issue of GDPR. So if you're collecting athlete information and you're using a web-based application, who owns the data? Who has proprietary, who has permission to share it? Where does it go? How long do you keep it for? So you need to be very clear from a GDPR and a confidentiality perspective where the data is going, what you're going to analyse it with. And the third point that you mentioned around the accuracy of the feedback, a lot of the apps that are available now are using artificial intelligence, and the recommendations are AI generated. So this disconnect between what the theory books say and what actually is feasible or viable in practice is often missing in some of this. So you might get recommendations that particularly for athletes who are at the outliers to normative body mass. So if you're 45 kilos or if you're 145 kilos, you can get recommendations that really make no sense. So for the average adult male would be the 70 kilogram man. So if your recommendations are all based on that, they're probably fine. But for outliers, the recommendations from a dietary perspective can be a bit outlandish.
Yeah, 'cause I even know, from seeing people in the past, they've gone to input shepherd's pie into MyFitnessPal, and the options you can choose from range from 250 calories to 1100, and it could literally be anywhere in between. And so many shepherd's pies, for example, are made completely differently, that the breakdown of macronutrients within that can be way off.
Yeah. Now you can do a thing. It's almost like the blue tick that was on Twitter in the past, that you can get foods that are blue ticked, that they've been verified by manufacturers, but you have to go into the settings to do all that. MyFitnessPal is the one that we've mentioned. There are scores of food and activity trackers available, but just to be mindful of that fact that the oversight for the data that's entered by the community of users might not always be there.
And we've pretty much answered this already, but what are some good resources to use when seeking guidance and recommendations for macronutrients? We've really touched on those, so it's a case of going back through them. And the the specific couple of papers we can use to recommend those. We link those. This will be up on YouTube, so just check below that there. I'm going to have a stab at answering this based on what you've said, and I want you to see if it's right or not. So if you're going to analyse an athlete's diet or a student's diet for the PAP, what are the three main areas you'd focus on, and how would you perform this? I'm actually going to touch the four. I would say overall energy expenditure or calorie intake, carbohydrate intake based on requirements for the sport they play, same with protein, and then fluid intake based off largely the urine test.
Yeah, spot on, exactly right.
And they'd be the four biggest contributors to overall athletic performance that you'd look to dip into. And then if lower than the recommendations, one of those, you then use that to set up a dietary plan intervention to try and improve that.
Yeah, spot on. You're hired.
Okay, this is where it becomes more specific now to say section B or design that plan. So if you're looking to increase an athlete's protein intake, what are some practical strategies you could use to do this? And then how would you hope to align that to recommendations around nutrient timing, particularly because the spec says before, during and after exercise, but also because what you've mentioned there across the entire day.
So if you remember the slide that I showed you that looked at the distribution across the time course of the day, there's very little point in launching straight in with having all the chicken breast at your dinner, because it's most likely that they have sufficiency of that main meal, whether it's in the evening or in the middle of the day. So the two lesser meals need to be augmented with roughly 15 grams of protein. Now what you're trying to find then are easily identifiable, not very expensive, throw it in your kit bag and away you go types of protein. So things like chicken fillets, it's the thing that everyone thinks of, but they're not very practical. You're not going to have it with your breakfast in the morning. But the good news is that almost every outlet, whether it's the German discount stores or our own multinationals, they all have high protein ranges. So whether it's granolas that have additional protein, whether it's chia seeds, whether it's the Greek yogurts that have a high protein content, they can all be put into breakfast in the morning. At lunchtime, it can often be as simple as adding in, like if you previously have a ham sandwich, have ham and cheese. If it's soup and you're just having a plain old roll, have a sandwich with it that has a protein content. The addition of the small things like baby bells or the single blocks of cheese that you can carry with you, it's trying to find things that are quick and easy. Not everyone likes it. In Ireland, unfortunately, we're quite low on fish consumption, but a really easy, cheap, convenient, portable thing would be tins of tuna, the single servers, or mackerel or sardines. Not everybody likes those. In fact, I'm sure some of the listeners are going, yeah, when you say bring your tin of mackerel with you, but they're really easy things to have on the go. And then for vegans or vegetarians, you're looking at nuts, nut butters, seeds, lentils, to try and ensure that you have all of those included. Nut butters are great as long as weight management isn't an issue, but they, particularly the higher quality ones, pack a good punch in terms of protein content, but they do have a bit of a fat content as well.
And in terms of timing, you probably find that breakfast time is where it's often lacking in a protein, and then just being mindful around trying to have something particularly directly after or very close to after exercise or after you're about to training.
Yeah, and there's a danger here that I'm going to sound like I work for a milk company, but there's so much research done by Irish researchers and Irish institutions looking at the benefits of dairy-based products, dairy-based fluids and beverages after exercise or even before and during exercise. So if you think of the recommendations, we're trying to find products that have fluid, electrolytes, carbohydrates and protein. So milk in its own right, whether it's low fat or full fat, will have a fluid, will have electrolytes, and will have a carbohydrate content, and will have a protein content. Now, if you throw in a chocolate milk or a high protein milk or a combination of chocolate, protein and oat milks, they depend, regardless of whether you're a 45 kilo or 130 kilo, a gymnast or a front row prop forward, you can get all that you need from a recovery product by a 500 ml carton of some variety of milk, with or without carbohydrate. And those are really easy, convenient, cost-effective methods of ticking all of the boxes for pre, during or post carbohydrates, fluids, electrolytes, protein in a very convenient, easy-to-go pack.
And similar to that question on protein then, if you're hoping to increase an athlete's carbohydrate intake, what are some practical ways you can look to do this, both in terms of across the day but also trying to time it around exercise? And I'll give two examples there. Say a school match at 12 o'clock in the day or at club training at 7 o'clock in the evening. Yeah,
so they're timely and good examples for me because I have a nearly 16-year-old who
possibly has to do both in the same day.
Yeah, well, I think for nearly all second level students who are involved in sport, there's very few of them who specialise or only do one. So a lot of the teenage athletes that I speak to at second level, they play football, hurling, rugby, basketball, swimming, and they do that both for clubs and schools, and some of them are on representative teams. So the biggest mistake that they make is generally not around fluids or protein or carbohydrate. It's that higher level stuff of overall energy adequacy. They're chronically underfueled. And it's probably because of the traditional method of I'll have a breakfast, I'll have a lunch, I'll have a dinner. But if you're looking at the energy demands of discrete physical activity sessions, those types of players need a breakfast, a snack, a lunch, a snack before training, a recovery snack, a dinner, and then if they're going club training again in the evening, they need the same around that. So it's the frequency is probably the biggest thing to change when it comes to optimizing carbohydrate intakes. So unfortunately at the moment there's a real trend led by bro science and influencers for low carbohydrate consumption. And there is, it's very hard for me to come up with a scenario whereby low carbohydrate intake over a prolonged period of time for any athlete is beneficial. The science just doesn't support it. But that seems to be the kind of the fad at the moment, to try and trend towards low carbohydrate intakes. So trying to ensure that at least 33% of food on any meal, breakfast, lunch or dinner, is contributed to from carbohydrate rich foods: breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rice, pastas, fruit and veg. And then as soon as that's done, it's increasing meal frequency and making sure that snacks are carbohydrate rich. So things like bagels and peanut butter, milk products that have chocolate in them, or even the addition of things like Nesquik or those flavoured milk powders to standard milk. Obviously the increased consumption of fruit and veg, smoothies, yogurt based drinks, all of those are beneficial as well.
And some of that can be helped by a little bit of planning in advance. For example, for break time in school at 11 o'clock, you can make some overnight oats that give you some fruit, some carbohydrates, some protein based on what you add. Also, if you're having pasta for dinner, cook a double portion to have some for lunch the next day based on what you've access to in school to heat that or store it or whatever it may be.
So this is one of the really interesting areas of research that I'm in at the moment, which is looking at foodscapes or environmental considerations for adherence with dietary practices or dietary recommendations. So you could go into a school, John, and be talking to a Hearty Cup team or a Senior Cup team and give them all this great advice on what they should have: breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack. Head to the pitch after your study session, do this. If there isn't a fridge, if there isn't a microwave, if there isn't a thermos flask, if there isn't a locker, then we're on a hiding to nothing. We're probably going to end up with food waste or food poisoning from some of these kids. So oftentimes the school, or whether it's from a school's perspective or an NGB, a national governing body for sport, rowing is a really good example here. There's a lot of education done for rowers on how to fuel, but they row in a small boat on the water for hours on end with nowhere to store their food. So the supports, the barriers and facilitators to the attainment of the dietary recommendations should also be considered.
So last question then, what are some useful resources you can use to find out fact-based information on supplements? I know I mentioned to you beforehand, I was just inquiring around examine.com to get some information, and if you are looking to source supplements, I'd usually look up the Informed Sport website, but you probably have a few more.
Yeah, so the things like the Clean Sport Advisor, which is available through the UK Anti-Doping Agency, or there's a Clean Sport programme that's available through Sport Ireland as well. And these are online education resources that are available for practitioners, but also for athletes. So they're ideally suited for learning outcomes for students within the Leaving Cert PE curriculum. They're free online resources that students can just log into and set up a learning profile, and then they can make their way through a suite of, there's 3 different programs, but the easiest one is the Introduction to Clean Sport, which gives them 6 modules layering sportsmanship and gamesmanship all the way through to how to assess risks when it comes to sport and what are anti-doping violations. So they're excellent resources. Now they speak more so to the processes and the systems and less so on the safety and legality of the supplements. So that website that you mentioned of Informed Sport allows it, that's a risk minimisation scheme to see how those products that we've identified align with WADA's banned substance list. But really in terms of looking at the efficacy or the potential efficacy, it's going back to the empirical data and the scientific literature to see who has this product been tested in, at what dose, in what presentation, over acute or a chronic phase, and does that match the athlete that I'm now working with. And as a caveat for supplement users, nearly all of the products that are available on the market have been tested in collegiate male recreational athletes. And this is just because that's the convenient sample that's available for researchers. So we don't have a huge amount of information that's available for women, and we certainly have an absence of safety data for adolescents, which isn't to say that they're unsafe, but we just don't have safety data to say that they are safe.
And tying your point earlier made during the presentation on trying to adopt as much as possible a food first approach.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a great researcher in the UK called Graham Close, and he added this, but not food only, to recognise that for those who either have dietary restrictions through cultural or preference or whatever, or those who have outside of the normal reference body mass. So if you're trying to feed, Graham at the time was working with the English Rugby Union, if you're trying to feed front rows who are 130 to 140 kilos on a gram per kilogram body mass per day basis, they would have to eat so much food that they wouldn't have time to train. And their skill acquisition and sport-specific skills would slip. So in that instance, yes, food first, but where it's unlikely or impossible to achieve dietary recommendations through food only, then supplements can be used as exactly as it says on the tin, to supplement a diet, but not as a first-line intervention. Food first, and then where necessary, you can add in supplements as necessary.
Catherine, thanks so much there for the whole presentation and for answering those questions. It's been super informative, and I know both teachers and students will find this hugely beneficial. All the various resources you mentioned today should be linked below somewhere in various guises, and we may put some PDFs and stuff together in a folder alongside where this is hosted. So again, thanks very much, Catherine.
Thank you.